everyone to this session. It's called the World If, which sounds a little bit like a children's guessing game, but think of it in terms of scenario planning. The way it works is this: we take an event that's possible, and we just agree that it's happened, and then we don't discuss the plausibility or whether it's going to happen. We decide this event has happened. So what are the consequences for Canada? And they can be, economic, political, social. But the things that we should be worried about, concerned about, let me put it that way, ready to take action if these events happen. And for this exercise in imagination, I'm joined by John Manley, Linda Nazareth, Paul Fraser. And we also have, apparently, if the app is working correctly, there's a question that you can be thinking about and answering during this particular panel. So I'll give you the poll question, which is, would you reconsider your US investments and business operations if Donald Trump becomes president? Okay. And that actually feeds into our very first scenario, which is, it's November 9th. Donald Trump has just won the US presidential election. So I want to ask the panelists, what's the first thought that runs through your head? I'll start with you, John.
I want a wall. We'll build it. No, I think it's always good to keep some perspective in terms of what the powers of the US president really are. He has many, of course, but he is also constrained by the US Constitution, by Congress, by other forces within the economy. So before we all jump off a bridge, we're building a bridge, by the way, we should really consider what he can do. There are a few themes that we don't really know what he would do, because I don't think he really knows what he would do. But we know that it's going to be a very nationalistic tone, very aggressive on trade issues, bilateral trade issues, I think you can expect. By the way, I think you could expect that with Hillary as well. A lot of noise around defense spending. That's often the case, but the free rider accusation will certainly be directed our way. And trade agreements probably have very little prospect of being ratified. So for Canada, we've got to realize that a lot of our bilateral trade is going to be, there'll be more friction. And on defense, we're going to get a lot of pressure to start to spend increasing amounts of GDP on it. And we face the fact that we have a very nationalistic US president, which is not dissimilar from the rise of nationalism in many other parts of the world. Okay, so keep calm and carry on, basically, and be prepared. Well, we're a small, open economy, very dependent upon our relationship with the United States, and by the way, they have a lot of dependence on their relationship with Canada as well that they don't often think about or perhaps even know about. But nevertheless, it's very important to us. And we've had presidents that were not particularly electable in Canada before. And my view was, if we're running a business and one of our customers purchases 70% of what we sell, we probably better find a way to get along with them, whether we like them or not. Whether they come into our shop and they spit on the floor, doesn't really matter. They're still, until we find somebody else to take that share of our market, then we just have to find ways to manage the relationship. Okay. Linda.
Well, it's an interesting question. I think it depends, Madeleine, on whether we expect this. If the polls going into the election show that he is going to win, well, then you're not going to get a whole lot of financial market reaction. If it doesn't look that way, first thing that's going to happen is you probably, ironically, get this rally in US Treasuries, which sends US interest rates lower because every time something bad, I mean, it's I guess subjective to say bad, but something startling happens, that's what happens, you get a flight to safety. And then after that, I guess it is open. Is he really going to rip up NAFTA? Can he do that? Probably not. But they'll be concerned about that. Is he really going to put in that insane, again, subjective, tax cut that is going to send the US deficit through the roof? Is he really going to build any kind of walls? I don't know. He could be a guy that's good for business. I mean, he's been in business his whole life. Surely there are going to be things that the equity markets will like. Having said that, he's on record as saying the US equity markets are overvalued, which I don't see at all because you have valuations now which are pretty much at their long-term historical averages, not like during the dot-com years. So I'm not sure what he's talking about when he says there's a bubble and he needs to fix that. He's going to fix that. So there's obviously these huge uncertainties. Now, my real concern is there such a lack of confidence in him that you see investment shutting down, that you see consumer spending shutting down, that he does things that really hurt trade, and he forces a recession? And we can't answer that quickly, but it's something we'll have to figure out over the first year or two. And the other thing is, if he really does force interest rates lower because there's a rally to bonds, and because he actually causes the US economy to slow, it's actually going to keep Canadian rates lower. And it's like saying a Trump victory is going to be another thing that boosts the Canadian housing market. Because we'll be in this weird situation again, as we were after 9/11, as we were, as we have been for several years post the global slowdown, where Canadian rates are just incredibly low, and some industries benefit and some don't. So it will be a very interesting ride. We'll see what happens.
Right. Okay, Paul.
Well, I share the view that should he win, we all do have to take a deep breath and give some real thought to what interests Canada has in play as of day one. We do have to John's point, with respect to certain constraints on the president and the leeway a president does have in certain areas, whether it's the economy, whether it's trade, but we will have to take a very close look simultaneously at who's in the Congress, who are the winners and the losers as a result of that national election in November, because as previous presidents with majorities in both the House and the Senate have demonstrated, they don't control either one, and they don't actually control their party people in either one. Keeping in mind that every day, I think each of those 100 senators in the morning looks in the mirror and says, well, that person in the White House is fine, but I actually should be there. And while I'm waiting to be there, I've got some powers of my own that I'd like to give full rein to. So across the range, on trade agreements, Congress does have a particular role. However, harassment, sudden determinations with respect to steel imports, aluminum imports, negotiation of a softwood lumber agreement, the president and administration has a lot of leeway. President Obama placed a tariff on Chinese tire imports into the United States. It was a good political move, bad economic move for Americans. So the Pennsylvania Avenue is littered with these kinds of actions. But I do think that it's not only looking at what immediately affects Canada's interests in a bilateral sense, but to the issue on defense spending, the future mission and role of NATO, its viability, other trade agreements such as CETA, which have always been important for Canada. I think we need to move that along to the best of our ability and bring that to fruition in working with the Europeans. As to U.S. negotiations on their interests with Europe, that's a slow ball issue at best.
Okay, but is there one thing, all of you have sort of listed a number of consequences you see. Is there one that is the priority in your mind, one that, you know, our government, our business should be preparing for that possibility right now? Is it trade, you know, is it?
Well, and also at the border, we have no idea how any of his particular trade actions would affect the border. Canada is also eager to get infrastructure projects in place at that border. Those are critical, and John knows that very well from his experience after 9/11. So
okay, well, you've just added another one to the list now. But is there a priority? Is there a particular area that you should think that it should be central to the government's focus right now in preparation?
Well, first, I'd say we heard Minister Morneau earlier this morning say what I consider to be exactly the right thing. Your colleague accused him of dodging the question, but he said the only thing that you can say, we don't get to vote in their election.
Yeah.
We are not members of the Democratic Party. Even the New Democrats are not members of the Democratic Party.
You have to
We
tell
don't
them.
get to say. So whoever they choose, we're going to have to build a constructive working relationship with them. So the key thing on November 9th is the Prime Minister should be first in line to call and congratulate, begin to build the working relationship that is critical to so many things. And then, the other things that we've been trying to do come into play. We're trying to diversify our trade. Hard to do. You can only make water run uphill for so long. But confirming CETA is I know, is a key priority of the Trudeau government. The possibility that we look to salvage something out of TPP, for example, with Japan, which is our 5th largest trading partner, gives us an avenue to look to alternative routes. We should hug Mexico as tightly as we can. We should, and hopefully later this month when the North American Leaders Summit occurs in Ottawa, the government will be able to resolve the Mexican visa issue, because we're going to need alternatives and we're going to need friends. And if one of them is not in the White House, then all the more reason we need others.
Okay. Linda, have you got anything to add before we move on to the next one?
I was just a little scared to think we wouldn't have a friend in the White House. I think we have to make friends with Mr. Trump, however friendly he is post-election. My real concern is not even the trade deals, and I'm a little bit optimistic he may do something positive on pipelines, which we haven't seen in a long time. It's what he does to the global economy. Yeah. And we just have to work from there. We may have to adjust our policies, fiscal policy, monetary policy, to cope with what the President of the United States does on a larger scale.
And actually, if I could jump in on that, because this actually is it's the global economy, but it's also U.S. leadership in the world, which I think we could all say has been declining to some degree in any event. But TPP should not be looked at so much as a trade agreement, as a very important expression of American interests in Asia. It's the signal of President Obama's pivot to Asia, and anyone who denies that it has an impact on China and its role in Asia is just missing the point. So for TPP to go away, which I think it would be difficult for President Trump not to cause to happen, for him to talk openly about nuclear proliferation in Japan, potentially in South Korea. These are very destabilizing directions, even if some of them are not actually achieved. And I think for Canada, I mean, yeah, we've tried to carve out a role for ourselves, very close to the U.S., but independent enough that we've got our own position in the world. That works when the U.S. is really breaking the wind. They're ahead of us, and we can kind of bicycle along in their draft. If they're no longer taking that leadership role, the world lacks a really coherent leader. Others will fill that void. And I think that's where I would be the most concerned. It's not so much about how it affects just Canada looking across the border. It's how the global architecture of the economy, but also security and global relationships really get reshaped in an America that is more nationalistic, less altruistic, which I think is a word you could use to describe the America we've known since World War II, and withdrawing from its key leadership role.
Okay. You have something brief to add?
Very fast, and that is that Americans don't appreciate those aspects, And Canadians often forget that we are expected to know and understand the Americans better than anybody else. So in a way, that's a sub-role for Canada, regardless of who becomes president, is to explain that to the world and deal frankly with Washington at the same time.
Okay. I find it a little bit worrying, your comment about someone else will move into the gap, but we'll go on from here to the next scenario. And
Well, we've already seen that with the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank.
yeah.
I mean, China has a view of itself as being eventually the largest economy in the world, already the second largest.
So they would be number one in terms of,
Yes, and regionally you'll have others that move in. We've seen the rise of Russia and its influence and its participation. I don't think there's going to be any shortage of those wanting to fill regional vacuums if the U.S. and as the U.S. Withdraws.
so among the friends that we should make to prepare for this scenario, China would be certainly up there.
We need to know that there's no longer going to be somebody in the schoolyard who goes and puts the bully in his place. We're going to be in a tougher world in which we're still a small country, but we're going to have to fend for ourselves more so than we have in the past.
Realistically, whoever's in the White House, China and Asia control far more of the financial assets in the world than I think most people are cognizant of. It wasn't like this 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. That's who could move currencies, who could move US bonds, who could finance all kinds of projects all over. So as much as there's presidential power, I think about the real power is where the capital is, and that's where it's growing.
Right.
And
Okay.
I think you saw it this week with the meeting of members of the Obama cabinet with their Chinese counterparts in Beijing. It's an annual meeting, something we don't have for Canada at this stage, but even there, very frank discussions, very little agreement, and the Chinese are demonstrating, to John's point, that they are aspiring to and think they're getting close to being number one in so many ways.
All right. Okay. Good discussion. We'll move on here. I think we probably only get time for two. So the next one, and it is bilateral again, is on water. You hear more and more that the next great world war is going to be fought over water, and certainly our own ambassador to the U.S., Gary Doer, was speculating about potential water wars in the future over the border. I'm not sure he used the word war. I think there were more tensions, but in the headline it became a water war. Anyhow, so the scenario is this, that Congress decides to change the Great Lakes Compact that right now is an agreement on who can take water out of the Great Lakes and how much they can take, and decides that the drought in the U.S. Southwest is sufficient enough that they're just going to go ahead, build that pipeline, and start moving the water out. So what are the consequences for Canada? What sort of how can Canada defend against this, especially if it's something that's already in train? And I'll start with you, Paul.
Well, the whole act would strike at the heart of some pretty intricate infrastructure that's existed for over 100 years between Canada and the United States. Water is also something that's covered within the NAFTA, and prior to that, the trade agreement between Canada and the United States. The issue here with respect to the Congress taking that decision is that the first conflict would be within the Congress, particularly between those congressional representatives from the states that want the water and the states that have the water, certainly those bordering the Great Lakes, but frankly upriver, up the Colorado and in different parts of the U.S. watershed. So for Canada, which at the present is also facing a renegotiation of the Columbia River Treaty, this would come at a particularly sensitive time. Also, the most recent case of water diversion from the Great Lakes caused enough of a political brouhaha within the Great Lakes region that this issue or effort by the Congress would immediately place in jeopardy and question the International Joint Commission and its responsibilities, let alone, as I say, a whole intricate set of structures in place. What does Canada do? Canada dams rivers. Does Canada divert rivers? What does it do? I think before we get to that point, again, it brings me back to the Congress, that when we see these things kind of happening, the government of Canada has to go for its friends, make its friends, find its allies, and work them so that we, in fact, can limit whatever damage this very serious issue could cause.
But is there something on the policy level, and I'll ask this to you, John, that Canada should be working on right now in terms of these international treaties, perhaps, things that you can actually put up fences, not fences is a bad word, but to protect yourself more in future against something like this?
Well, there is a treaty, and the International Joint Commission is a product of that. It's existed since 1907. They really have the jurisdiction to oversee this. It's worked quite well, as Paul alludes to. What you're really speculating on is the United States unilaterally abrogates all of its responsibilities under those relationships. I don't think there's anything we can do in advance of that, but I think there is a very practical issue here, and it's difficult for Canadian politicians because, quite frankly, water is, I would say, way more than healthcare, the third rail of Canadian politics. And there's a guy who used to be very active in the federal political scene, who was an environment minister in Quebec, who at one point seemed to be willing to tolerate water exports from his province. What was it, Mulcaine or something? It doesn't sell well. And so it's therefore, I almost hesitate to say this, but we may need to look very pragmatically at the resource and what can practically be done in the event of serious drought conditions developing in parts of North America. It is our continent. So, the IJC has evaluated the Great Lakes as being non-renewable. In other words, the current drain on the Great Lakes is barely, the rainfall is barely sufficient to recover what's being used. Obviously, if the water level in the Great Lakes falls significantly, you shut down the shipping lanes all the way down through the St. Lawrence. As Paul says, there's a lot of US interests that are not going to tolerate that. And I guess the other thing to think about is it always seems incredible to me, having been to Dubai now several times, that they host this big international golf tournament every period of time. If Dubai has figured out how to turn salt water into fresh water such that it can develop golf courses on the desert, then surely we've got to start, as part of climate change mitigation, to put serious research into desalinization on scale levels that enable us to actually use the oceans to meet some of these water challenges.
So you're thinking about that as a suggestion for Canada or for North America writ large?
This is a global problem, and we seem quite prepared to put money into solar panel research and wind turbines. I think that we've got to increasingly start to recognize that not only is climate change a reality, but there are no reduction of carbon emission measures that Canada can take that will make a significant impact on that reality. Therefore, what are the other things that we can do? We need to do much of what we are doing, but perhaps we ought to be looking at how we mitigate some of these problems. And one of those would be to say, what can we do in the area of desalination?
Okay. Linda.
I think there's two sides to this. First of all, there's the actual question, what can we do? My first thought is, have we learned anything from energy? Did we learn how to deal with that scarce resource? Because it seems to me we have a certain amount of time to do, as John says, and do some research on this and put some money in it and see if we can do anything with purification or technology to make this less of a problem, because it will be a major problem when it happens. And I also wonder if Canada has an edge here as a country that has some of these resources. Can we come out on top of this? Is there a way to make that happen? But my real reaction to this is that this whole water issue is almost a side issue to your scenario, which is that you have these drought conditions in the US. And one of the questions we aren't talking about right now is the issue of food and food prices, which have been so low for so long that lifestyles have been built around that in North America. It's given us really, in real terms, lower prices than we've seen for decades, over the last decade. If we actually have this scenario where you have drought for a sustained period of time, that's a whole rethinking of a lifestyle. That's grocery bills that are huge. That's inflation that's at a level we are not used to. And it takes us to, I think, a much lower level of growth than we have been used to. So it's a big sea change in terms of how we will live our lives if that happens. And yeah, water will be part of it, and rationing water might be part of it, but there'll be a lot of other changes as well.
Okay. I know you want to say something, Paul, but I just want to remind the audience to vote for the poll question on the app, if you do have an opinion of it. Paul.
A couple of quick comments on that issue of water, and that is that if we accept that Mr. Trump might become president, and then we look to the Paris Accords on climate change, and to John's point about how we take a North American perspective, there may actually be a kind of common sense approach that could be taken with the Trump administration, because we can connect it to a number of very important economic factors, and also areas that would affect his constituency rather directly, in agriculture, in labor, and other areas. And so I think that we may find ourselves at some point having to pull back to a North American perspective on this in particular, but to help drive that, because it's not really being thought through in that broader scope at present in the United States.
Morning. My name is Patrick Gagnon. I'm actually, I served with John many years ago in the House of Commons. I'm the managing partner of the parliamentary group in Ottawa. I've just returned from the European Business Summit last week, and following a presentation made by our minister responsible for international trade and commerce, there's a lot of talk about CETA. And evidently for the Europeans, CETA is viewed as obviously the template for other agreements that could perhaps be passed, be it with the Americans and, of course, TPP and so on and so forth. But I must say everyone was somewhat morose because of what's going on in the UK, the upcoming referendum, tensions in the Ukraine, and there's a feeling that should these things not pass, especially the British situation, and obviously the rise of populism, a little fancier word if you want for something that reminds us of the late 30s. But that said, I'd like to know what prescriptions would you have if the British do leave the European Union? And this is futurism gone mad, by the way. And also, should not be endorsed, because the EU Trade Commissioner, this is my last point, did say in front of everybody that we're not sure legally if this is a deal that will be voted in within the EU, the Parliament, or the national governments, and even regional governments might be involved. So I would just like to hear your take on this. If none of this happens, the Brits leave and CETA is not approved, what is Canada's next step?
Okay, you didn't like our scenarios. You've chosen one of your own. Can you answer that briefly? I know that we are going to get back to it later on in the conference, but I think the question was addressed to you. Is that correct? Yes.
Well, there's two questions there, actually.
Right.
There's Brexit and there's CETA, and they may overlap or they may not. I mean, I think that if the British vote yes, I mean, there's a whole lot of processes that have to still be gone through. The referendum has no direct legal impact. So for the British to withdraw from Europe will require parliamentary process. And you've got a lot of things that will fall out from this. I'd predict David Cameron will be forced to step down. I suspect that the Chancellor would also need to step down. You've got chaos in the Conservative Party. The Labour is not quite ready to. This will take time. So if I were advising Prime Minister Trudeau on this, I would say call the Europeans and say, gain momentum on something else, get CETA done. And yes, there's a question, there may be parts of CETA that need to be approved by national governments, but get it through the Commission and the European Parliament first. My information is that we think we have the votes for that now. Get that done and move on to the individual country governments. Try to keep momentum going there. It also gives us a narrative that will be useful in the event that TPP fails, because if we have CETA in one pocket and we can do something bilateral with Japan on the other side, and we have NAFTA and underlying NAFTA, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, which by the way would still be in effect even if NAFTA were revoked, which I think is unlikely, but we have for once, we might actually be the hub to some spokes.
Amazing. Okay, there was the question in the middle here.
Yes, hi. It's on? Okay, yes, hi, Rahul Vaidyanath from Epoch Times. This is a question, I guess, primarily for Mr. Manley. You had talked about under a Trump presidency, if there is a Trump presidency, that would lead to, or could lead to, a diminished importance of the U.S. globally, or less altruistic U.S., more nationalistic U.S., and presumably that opens the door for China. So if you could speak to what that means for Canadian businesses, how they would deal with China, that I guess it's a worse alternative or a less familiar alternative than dealing with the U.S., and kind of what that challenge is for businesses dealing with Canada, as opposed to sort of the U.S. kind of paving the way a little bit more for Canada globally. Thank you.
Yeah, I think where U.S. leadership has been really important in the world, historically it has been in the trade file ever since World War II, as the GATT emerged, and then the WTO was always with U.S. leadership. And the absence of that leadership really causes you to wonder just, who will actually be part of that movement going forward. And then in terms of security, we have a Donald Trump saying, why are we in NATO? The others aren't paying their way. Which, by the way, you could make a pretty good case is true when you look at percentages of GDP spent on defense and security. And when you look at the risks in the world, you'd have to say maybe that's unwise. But for the U.S. to withdraw, to say that some of these regional conflicts are not our problem anymore, much as we've always complained about U.S. being too interventionist, I think we're going to discover that we actually miss them quite a bit when their role disappears. They've spent a lot of treasure and a lot of lives in parts of the world where they had no aspiration of seizing control or occupying, and the lack of a global policeman could be a fairly chaotic outcome. So for Canadian businesses, it's not so much that they lead us on the business side, it's that they have created a world order in which business can thrive in an international environment. And I think for Canadian businesses, what that's going to mean is they're going to pick their places very carefully, and this is already happening. Increasingly, security is an element in deciding where you want to make investments. Needing to build good bilateral relations. Many of the members of my council worried over the Harper years that our relationship with China was somewhat on and off, and that was definitely not helpful to them in trying to gain a foothold in that large economy. So it will be more important forever for the Canadian government to have its own strategy on international trade and investment and provide that kind of leadership.
Thank you. I really want to get the last two. Have you got a comment on that, a brief comment?
Two quick comments.
Yes.
One is that the more unstable the rest of the world is, the more Canadian business is thrust into the United States market. It doesn't venture out. It's hobbled, as it were. So that's another reason for wanting a stable, reliable American presence globally. In a way, the world's like a kennel, and the puppies all are looking around, and where's the alpha dog on this? And the alpha dog, if it starts to fret and not do its job, the others start to get a little noisy and going in all directions, and that's what we should be worried about. It's, in Canada-US relations, it's very much about how Canada manages that relationship, because the Americans will never manage it the way we need to see it managed. So that is fundamental throughout for Canada.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry we're out of time, but before this panel leaves the stage, the poll results are now in for the question that we asked you at the beginning of the session. Would you reconsider your U.S. investments and business operations if Donald Trump becomes president? Well, that's interesting, because the yeses really aren't that much higher than the nos. So I guess we're keeping, as our panelists suggested, an open mind. Now, I'd like to thank our panel very much for playing What If with me, and I thought there were some very interesting answers that came out of it for people to consider.